I'm Julia Cumberledge, and I've been asked to chair this review by Jeremy Hunt before he left. I didn't know he was going. He didn't know he was going, but there you go. On my left is Sir Cyril Chandler, and Cyril is the vice chairman of the three-person panel. And then on my right is Simon Whale, who is the third person of the panel. And he looks particularly at communications and how we work with patient groups and so on. And then on Simon's right is Dr. Valerie Brassin. She's our secretary to the review. And on Cyril's left is Dr. Sonia MacLeod, who is our senior researcher. So that's. Then we've got other people in the room who are just helping us run the event, as it were. Anything you want to ask me before you go? No. Right. Okay. So if you would like to say who you are and why you're here, really, that would be very helpful. And then perhaps we could ask a few questions.
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm Deborah Jack, and I'm the Executive Director of the Thalidomide Trust. I want to sort of preface whatever I say by saying I don't have a good knowledge of the impact of the particular drugs you're looking at and the effect they have, or the needs of the individuals affected, but I'm aware that there are patient groups who've given a lot of evidence on that. And I'm here because we were invited to come and give evidence, and I guess to share our experience as a charity supporting a defined group of individuals who were born with birth defects. And hopefully there's some learning that will be useful to you.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Can I just ask, have you any conflicts of interest, sort of personal conflicts of interest?
No, not at all.
Okay, well, thank you for that. So perhaps you tell us a bit more about the trust, how it works and how it's changed over the years, because, of course, it's been going a very long time now.
Yes. So I suppose, I'm sure you've probably got some knowledge of thalidomide and the Thalidomide Trust, but just to say the charity was established in 1973, and that was part of the original compensation package that was agreed with a distiller company who distributed the drug in the UK. We currently support 463 individuals who are affected by thalidomide. And it's worth saying that they're now, we were originally the Thalidomide Children's Trust back when we were set up, but all our beneficiaries are now aged between 53 and 60. In fact, in January, the first of our beneficiaries celebrated their 60th birthday, which I think exceeded any expectations anyone had when they were born. I think an interesting fact about thalidomide is there isn't one pattern of damage. The way the drug affected the fetus was it damaged the part that was growing when the mother took the drug. So we've got quite a range of disabilities within our beneficiary group. There's some that are quite common, like upper limb damage, which affects 85% of the beneficiaries, but there's a whole range of damage to internal organs, sensory impairment, facial damage, it is really, and cognitive impairment in some cases. So we're not talking about just one known model and one set of needs. And many of the beneficiaries have got quite complex needs that have actually become more complex as they become older. The trust was originally set up to administer the grants that were given in compensation to the individuals, but over time the role of the trust has evolved and has become more and more focused on non-financial support to beneficiaries. And also over time there's been an increase in the number of beneficiaries who've actually engaged with the charity. So often it was just that people would receive their money every year, say thank you very much, and there was very little contact with the trust. But now we have quite a lot of ongoing contact. So in the last year, 75% of beneficiaries had some contact with the trust in terms of utilising the support and services that we provide. So a bit about the trust, we've got 16 staff. Around half of them are part-time staff, and they've got a range of skills and backgrounds. So we've got doctors, trained nurses, people with a background in social work, so quite a broad range of skills. And we also have a skill-based board of trustees who are all volunteers, and they come with a range of backgrounds including medical, legal, financial, research that they bring, and very much when we're looking at what we want from our trustees, we're looking ahead to what the needs of the charity will be going forward, and therefore trying to recruit trustees who have the skills that can help us with that task. We provide a mixture of, I suppose, reactive and proactive support. So a lot of beneficiaries come to us with specific needs they want help with, but also increasingly over the last 5 years we've been more proactive in reaching out to the beneficiaries who we may not have had a lot of contact with the past. And I think the support we provide is very much shaped by the needs of beneficiaries and has changed a lot over time. And I think something that's worth bearing in mind is the beneficiaries were born with their original thalidomide damage, but over time there's been consequential damage. So if you, for example, have damage to your upper limbs, you might use your bodies in ways that they were never designed for, perhaps using your lower limbs to do things that people would traditionally use their arms for, or their teeth, for example. And as a result, they've then developed consequential health problems from the way they've used their bodies. And what we're now seeing going into the mix is the impact of normal health issues involved with ageing and how they interact with both the primary damage and the consequential damage. So the needs seem to be becoming more and more complex for our beneficiaries. So that's a bit about the background. In terms of how we actually support them, we do that in a range of different ways. And one of the things we've been doing now for just over 2 years is what we call holistic needs assessments, or HNAs. And what that is a trained member of staff will go out and visit every beneficiary in their home and spend some time with them, just really understanding what's going on in their life, what the challenges they're facing, what the health issues are, how they feel the trust could support them. And what comes out of those HNAs is both an action plan for the individual, which is what we can do to help them, but also we're gathering really useful data on what sort of problems are faced across the community, what their worries are about the future. And that information therefore feeds into us planning what we want to be thinking about for the future. We also have a programme of beneficiary events where we bring beneficiaries together. And those are a combination of just general events, so they may be in a locality where we invite people to get together and we actually ask them for feedback on what issues they'd like covered. But we also have some events that are around specific issues. So we recently had an event called Fit for the Future, which was born out of beneficiaries telling us that they were worried about their weight, about their fitness as they got older and their flexibility. But living with disabilities, they found it really hard to exercise. Perhaps foods that are healthy are the foods that are more difficult to prepare. And so what we did was put together events which focused on both diet and fitness, had very practical sessions. And actually more recently we did an event called Future Money Matters, which came out of feedback from beneficiaries that they were worried about their long-term financial planning. Particularly they're worried that as their needs increase that they'll struggle financially. So there was a lot of different sessions there, everything for sort of almost retirement planning to thinking about their long-term costs, but also investments for those that have some money now but are worried about how it will benefit them in the future. But also external lending, because some of them are now getting to the point where they're no longer able to live in the homes they're in now, and they can see that in a few years they may have to move to a single-storey building or have their homes adapted, and they know that they've either got to save money or borrow money to be able to do that. So the events we do are very much dictated by what we're hearing they want from us, and we just try and tailor the support we give. And I think 10 years ago worries about money probably wouldn't have been top of the list, but they are now, and I guess in time the sort of topics they want to talk about will change. We have a whole team of a health and wellbeing team that provide health and wellbeing support, and that's mainly by the phone. So we have 2 practicing GPs who work for us part-time, but we have a team with a range of knowledge on things like benefits, aids and adaptations, mobility, adapted cars, all the different things that might help. So, our beneficiaries can then come to us and we can give them advice and support on what solutions might be. And one of the things we also try and do is share solutions that beneficiaries have found. So sometimes when you go and visit a beneficiary in their home, you find out a piece of equipment that is really useful and easy to use, or sometimes they just come up with their own bespoke solutions, but often we'll take photos or ask them about it, and then that information can then be shared with other beneficiaries who are facing similar challenges, really. I think the other thing worth saying is that increasingly we are helping beneficiaries to navigate the NHS. Sometimes they really struggle to provide the services and support they need when routine help isn't available. So one of the things we do is provide advice to them on what services are available, and sometimes we'll write letters, say to their GP, encouraging them to make a referral, or letters to a specialist they've been referred to. And also with social care, there's similar support we provide in terms of letting people know what sort of services they should be entitled to. But also a lot of beneficiaries employ carers. They receive direct payments, so they employ personal assistants. And that can be quite a big step, employing someone, knowing how to go about it and what the pitfalls are. So we provide advice and resources, just giving them tips of how to do it, what help's available, that sort of, and always we give case studies of how it's worked for other beneficiaries to try and help them with that. I mentioned financial guidance and advice, and that's something that we do provide on an ongoing basis. So I think, like any group of 460 odd people, there are some people who manage their money really well, and there are other people who really struggle to manage their money. And traditionally what the Trust has done is given people annual grants. So at 2 points in the year they receive their grant, and then it's up to them to manage that money to meet their needs throughout the year and in the longer term. But we've worked with some people who were finding it difficult to manage their money, and for example, for some people we provide the money on a monthly basis because they find that's easier to help them manage, or we hold some money back for big one-off costs. So it's just being there to not just look at their physical health and their emotional health, which is something I haven't mentioned, but there has been an increased emphasis on, because I think as people lose their independence and functionality, often what comes with that is a decline in their emotional and mental well-being. And so we provide emotional support through the staff team, but also we have a peer support service where our beneficiaries are trained to support each other if they're having emotional difficulties. So there's quite a range of sort of personal support from the staff to the beneficiaries. And we also produce a lot of written information, fact sheets, advice on different topics. And we have a website which is a sort of central depository for all that information. And we do try and encourage beneficiaries to share information via the website as well, because it's a way of enabling them to share communication. And a lot of the content on the website is generated by the beneficiaries themselves, them sharing their stories or experiences and providing information they think would be helpful to others. We do advocacy, so we advocate on behalf of beneficiaries, and that can be across a range of things, whether it's because they're not receiving the healthcare and support that they need, or if benefits assessments don't seem to be coming out with the right outcome, we can often step in if beneficiaries don't feel confident to do that themselves. And as well as advocating for individuals, we also do sort of advocacy on the community as a whole. So a couple of examples of where that is a role we've played recently. One was in terms of we were finding that beneficiaries when they came to be assessed for social care, the money they received from the trust was being treated as capital if they hadn't spent it in the year, or income, and therefore they were losing out on the care they were entitled to and on some means tested benefits as well. So we got into negotiation with Department of Health and Social Care and DWP and got changes to legislation so that the money that the beneficiaries receive from the trust is not taken into account when assessing their eligibility to other services and support. So the discussions with policymakers are always really useful. Even if you don't get the immediate answer you want, it can be really helpful in thinking about how you can best support your beneficiary group. Other things, sorry, I'm going on quite a lot here. We're developing a network of clinical specialists across the country because thalidomide is quite a rare condition. And what people found is if they, for example, I don't know, needed a hip replacement or a shoulder replacement, and they were just referred to their local orthopaedic hospital, often people were completely phased by it, and often they were advised that surgery wasn't indicated or that they didn't feel confident doing surgery. And what we have now identified is clinicians around the country who have seen a number of beneficiaries, who have a good understanding of thalidomide and who are willing to accept referrals and understand that you have to vary the procedures to take into account their needs. So we're beginning to build that network up across the UK. And I think the final thing in terms of the services and support we provide is just we do a small amount of targeted research, and we do research only into issues that are specifically of relevance to our beneficiaries. So an example, one of the projects we're working on at the moment is around cardiovascular risk. So as individuals move into their 50s, often one of their highest risk factors is cardiovascular disease or incidents, so strokes and heart attack. And the way most people have their risk assessed is through blood pressure taken in the arm. But if you don't have arms, then it can make it very difficult to assess cardiovascular risk. And the default position for a lot of people was saying, well, just take statins, better to be safe than sorry. But I think our group, more than any, are very reluctant to take drugs when there is no good reason to take them. So one of the things that we're looking at is, are there other reliable ways of assessing cardiovascular risk in the absence of upper limbs? And obviously that's very relevant to a lot of our beneficiaries, but it will have broader benefit because people lose limbs in all sorts of other situations as well. So that's a project we're doing with the Royal National Orthopaedic Hospital at the moment, just to give you an example. Another couple of points is, I mean, first of all, with such a small beneficiary group, user involvement is quite sort of critical to the way we operate as a charity and sort of central to our ethos. And we have what we call the National Advisory Council, and that's a discretionary body which allows our trustees and staff to get advice from beneficiaries. So there are elections every year, and all beneficiaries are able to vote. But people, a bit like normal elections, if people want to stand, they put their names forward and have a manifesto, and then there's an election. So we have at any one time 12 beneficiaries who form our National Advisory Council. They come to all our trustees meetings. When we've got big new projects, we involve them in how we design and develop the project, and their advice on an ongoing basis is really useful. And we also look at ways of involving beneficiaries as volunteers. So I mentioned, for example, the peer emotional support service that we provide, but they help in all sorts of different ways. So we've got another role which we call our Connect volunteers, which is where one of the beneficiaries will gather information on local services in any one area so that those are available and can be shared with beneficiaries in that part of the country. So it can be everything from, you know, say massage, which is really important for pain relief, and pain's one of the biggest issues faced by beneficiaries. But again, a bit like I said with orthopaedic surgeons, people are quite reluctant just to find a masseur in Yellow Pages and go along if they don't feel they'll understand their bodies and how they're different. So recommendations from beneficiaries, pulling together information. So that's just an example. But because we know our beneficiaries well, because we get out and meet them, we often discover skills they have that they're willing to share. So we recently rebranded. One of our beneficiaries was a graphic designer and was complaining how old-fashioned all the stuff that came from the trust was. So we said, great, come up with a new logo and branding, and that's what they did. Another beneficiary used to work on benefits appeals and has now taken retirement. So we use him to provide advice to other beneficiaries and has done some training with the staff on it. So it is very much a community, and there's a real willingness to support and help each other, and we try and harness that wherever we can. The final few points. We do have one dedicated member of staff who looks specifically after our beneficiaries who lack capacity. They're a small group, we only have 14, but they have got incredibly complex needs. And the fact they receive quite a lot of money from the trust, we want to make sure that there's the right support to ensure that those resources are being used to their benefit. They're probably more open to exploitation and abuse than our other beneficiaries, but also they often have quite complex needs. So we do have someone whose job is specifically to look after them. We also make it a point to draw on external expertise and services and support that's available. So we do a lot of signposting to other services rather than trying to recreate services that are already out there, because we wouldn't have the resources to meet every single need of all our beneficiaries. So an important part of our role is keeping in touch with what else is out there. And I suppose the final point is, as a charity, we have to think in the longer term about how we wind down the charity, how we eventually close the charity when beneficiaries aren't there. And there's not many charities, I think, that have that particular challenge. And I think one of the issues will be the number of beneficiaries will reduce, but their needs are likely to increase. So I think that the trust will just have to keep on developing and reinventing itself to make sure it's meeting the needs of its beneficiaries.
Well, thank you very much.
So I hope that was helpful.
Extremely helpful. And I must say, I think the way the trust is so sensitive to the needs of their beneficiaries is really very, very impressive. Congratulations on all of that. And the fact that you've got 75% of your beneficiaries in constant communication with the trust, that's really very, very good indeed. And I love your events. That's really. Can I ask you, in terms of when I was involved in the department with the beneficiaries, your beneficiaries, one of the things I did do was meet the children
Yes.
of the beneficiaries, and I wondered if there's any sort of dynamics, interests, whatever, between the children of beneficiaries and the beneficiary, him or herself.
So the interaction between all children across the border, between the children and
when I met your beneficiaries, and I think in those days we call them victims, sadly,
yes,
but I think your term is much better. They were being pushed by their children. They were in wheelchairs, and their children were pushing them, and it struck me that I had never thought of this next generation, and I wondered if there was anything to do with that you've come across with the children of the beneficiaries, whether they're interested in the funding systems, whether they have any influence over the beneficiaries. I just wondered if there was any dynamics we ought to be aware of.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I think a lot of children took on elements of a caring role for their parents. I think as the sort of access to electric wheelchairs, mobility scooters, other things have come in, and lots of gadgets and gizmos that mean people can dress themselves and do things for themselves. There's perhaps been less of that dependence, but people will often say, I dress in clothes that are easy to wear, but if I've want to put a bit of jewellery on or do buttons up, I always need help from a family member or someone to do it. But I think the children have supported beneficiaries in lots of different ways, and one of the bits of feedback we've had quite a lot is that as they've grown up and left home, if you think of the age of our beneficiaries, a lot of them, their children have left home, gone to university, and they suddenly realise all the small things that they did for them just to make their life go a bit more smoothly, and that has resulted them then often having to get paid care in to fill some of those gaps. I think it's quite complex family dynamics in some cases. I think some beneficiaries have given quite a lot of financial support to their children, partly maybe in recognition of the help they've had, partly for some feeling guilty that they couldn't be the parent they wanted to be because they couldn't play football with their child. And so there are some quite complex relationships and financial dependencies there. And certainly one of the issues that's come through quite strongly from our beneficiaries is worrying about when they're not around, about their families, and feeling that if they hadn't been born with thalidomide damage and they'd been able to work, perhaps in better jobs, they would have had more financial security to help their children. But it really varies across the community. One thing I was going to mention, I don't know if you're aware of the Thalidomide Society. So the Thalidomide Society was set up actually in advance of the Thalidomide Trust, and it was very much an organisation for the parents of thalidomide children, but it's kept going to this day, and its focus is very much on the social element and networking, and also on the history of thalidomide, and they've done some amazing work on capturing sort of oral histories of beneficiaries. But they have events every year, and some children come along and they then meet each other, and there's an element of sort of peer support and networking, so that does give them an opportunity to get involved.
Can I just ask you, then you are still getting new applications, aren't you?
We are.
For the Trust. And presumably they're reducing in numbers, but I understand sometimes you get a spike, as you did in 2010 when the government came in with some funding for
the Midwife, when they did the thalidomide storyline, created another mini spike as well.
And also, I think, Call the Midwife had an impact, yes. So I'm just wondering, how do you assess now people who are coming forward, who you would have expected to have come forward in the past, and now they come forward perhaps because maybe they've only just heard about the financial support or something like that, but then you have to assess them, and that must be very difficult.
Yeah, we have a very sort of robust evidence-based model for assessing new claimants that come in, and I mean, very quickly you can discount some people because they're the wrong age, for example, because people in their 30s might approach and say, I think I've got thalidomide damage, and that can't be the case. But what we do is we've got a lot of evidence of what the pattern of thalidomide damage was, and we've worked with other countries in sharing evidence. We had a big event with the WHO in 2014, and from that we pulled together the evidence into a sort of algorithm where you can look at the pattern of damage that someone has and assess the likelihood that it's thalidomide embryopathy. And in parallel, you look at what evidence there is that their mother ingested the drug. In very rare cases, you can actually see the mother's medical records and see that she was prescribed Distaval. What's more likely is it's a witness statement from a mother or a family member telling you that.
But the parents might be dead by now.
Yes. And that, I mean, going back a step to why are people only applying now, I think the two main reasons that people are still coming forward, one is that their thalidomide damage was quite minor, and so for many years they were able to live completely independently, they didn't think they needed support. But I mean, an example of someone recently, someone who was born without thumbs, but years of just twisting your arms in different ways, they then developed chronic pain, they had to give up work, and at that point they decided, I've always known I was thalidomide, I wonder if there's any help available. The other perhaps sadder scenario is where they know that while their parents are alive, they couldn't possibly address the issue because it's such a thorny issue within the family, so they actually wait for their parents to pass away before coming forward. And of course that makes it difficult, because it then makes the evidence of ingestion in particular far more difficult to come by. But we have a claims committee. It's very formal, you know, lawyers, doctors, they look at all the evidence, and then they have to make a decision on the balance of probability as to whether or not someone was thalidomide affected. So over the last 5 years, we've had between sort of 25 and 45 applications each year, but on the whole we accept probably 2 individuals each year. So it's a small number that reach the evidential threshold, and we have to, you know, that those decisions are life-changing to be accepted as a beneficiary. So our trustees take them very seriously and really ensure that evidence is scrutinised, more evidence is asked for if necessary, so we make the best possible decision we can.
So there is sort of an informal right of appeal? So
there isn't really, no. I mean, if people apply, they're assessed. Occasionally, people have employed lawyers on a no-win, no-fee basis and come back. But I think the view is, because we have quite a structured process for assessing the evidence, unless they've got new evidence, they're only going to have the same conclusion, because it is quite a, I suppose, clear process for assessing the damage.
You said about the algorithm there. I mean, have there been presumably changes in the way thalidomide damage has been diagnosed since the first 60s and 70s to now?
Yeah, not vastly, but there is improved knowledge, particularly of the, I think, the non-visible elements of thalidomide damage. So, for example, one, I guess, of the most obvious ones is if someone had damage to their reproductive organs, that may not have been obvious when they were assessed as a 10-year-old, but actually later when they go to try and start a family and are having problems, they suddenly realise that there has been damage to the reproductive organs. So that then is taken into account, but that sort of knowledge is built in. So the algorithm, we're working with St George's Hospital on that, and the idea is if there is new evidence, we will refine and develop the algorithm. And, you know, there are still cases coming through in the UK and in other European countries, but it will also have validity in countries like Brazil, where there's, you know, contemporary cases in terms of assessing whether or not it is thalidomide damage.
Why St George's?
I'm not sure, really. The decision was made before I joined the charity. I think there's doctors with an interest in thalidomide there, and they have sort of developed as a centre of expertise. And certainly when we have someone who is indicated to be probable thalidomide, we then refer them to St George's, and they will do the investigation, any scans, and also genetic tests, because one of the issues is a lot of the damage that you see in thalidomide does occur either naturally or has a genetic cause.
And who pays for that? Is that commissioned by the CCG or?
No, the trust pays for that. And that the money that comes from that really comes from Diageo, who provide funding to the trust, and who look to us to have this sort of robust process in place.
So the NHS would not provide that service?
No.
Why not?
I don't know. I mean, some people have had genetic tests by the time they come to us, but generally speaking, if we want the genetic tests in order to exclude other genetic conditions that could be causing the damage, then we pay for it. I don't know. It's also the speed thing, because often it's taken people years to come forward for to apply to be a beneficiary, and what we don't want is that process to be really prolonged. And as it is, genetic tests can take 4 to 6 months sometimes to come back if they're quite complex ones, and that's paying for them privately. So
Thank you. Just so we can get in our minds the size of the enterprise, how much money have you distributed over the years?
I don't have that figure off the top of my head, I'm afraid, but
About?
gosh, I don't know, since I honestly don't know
Perhaps
since
you let us
53. I can give you some figures.
And how many beneficiaries have there been over the years?
Over the years, I think there's been around 500 and somewhere around 550.
Of whom 463 are
still alive,
involved.
yes. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. And could you just explain again, in a very summary way, briefly, how you've approached right from the start the distribution of the funds?
Well, as I said earlier, the interesting about thalidomide is there's not one established pattern of damage. So what happened is when individuals were accepted by the trust, they had medicals which were quite in-depth, and from that all of them were allocated a score on a range, which is an indication of the severity of their disability. And that's using sort of established mechanism using courts in terms of damages. So everybody, all of our beneficiaries have a number on this scale. With a higher number, the greater the level of disability. And the money they receive each year in grants increases with it's a multiplier. So the more disabled you are with original thalidomide damage, the more money you'll receive. And beneficiaries receive from us 2 grants each year. One is a payment of essentially compensation that comes from funds from Diageo, and then the second payment is what's known as the health grant, and that's the funding that comes from the 4 UK Departments of Health and Social Care. But both of them are made on the same formula, which is the greater your level of disability, the greater level of funding you receive.
So is that the disability at the outset, the initial consequence?
The original damage.
But if subsequently you talked about the consequential damage, that's quite interesting, and that may not move pro rata to the initial, so it may be that their consequential needs become greater. Does the scoring affect their grants?
No.
This doesn't change to take account of the consequential.
It doesn't, and that's one of the things that we've become more aware of, and one of the things we're looking at is having an additional pot of funds for exceptional needs, so that if people do develop additional health needs in particular, that there's a way of providing additional funding. It's also really difficult because you can have 2 individuals who are born with identical patterns of damage, and one of them is functioning at a really, really high level and the other one isn't. And some of it is down to lifestyle choices, some of it's down to the lives they've led, and so it is, in some ways, it's a very clear, well understood methodology for doing it. In other ways, it doesn't necessarily equate with needs. But actually, our beneficiaries are very, very wedded to it. Anytime there's any suggestion we might move away from funding, say particularly for the health grant, for example, the beneficiaries on the National Advisory
So you don't
Council,
have any funds that you distribute according to needs?
Not at the moment, no. That's something we're looking at. At the moment, the degree of their original damage is perceived to be a proxy for their needs. But we know it isn't that simple and straightforward, really.
But they prefer it that way.
They like it that way. And how much of that is down because that's the only way they've known, and everyone, no one likes change, I don't know. But I mean, I suppose the reality is if we moved to a different methodology, there'd be winners and losers. And I think everyone feels sort of comfortable with the status quo at the moment. But I think it is something, and it's one of those tricky decisions that the trustees will ultimately have to make, is how far we're certainly going to start with looking at these exceptional needs, but over time that pot might get bigger and the other pots
What
reduce.
is the most you give out at the moment to an individual in a year? Or are you allowed to say?
I can provide that information to you, yes. I mean, I don't know the figure off the top of my head,
Yes.
and also it is quite sensitive information.
Can I just ask 2 questions? You talked about this scale, which I thought was really interesting. Were the beneficiaries involved in the scale so that they understood it? Did they give their agreement to it, or did you, because it was so long ago and you were forming the trust, you just decided to do it?
This is the scale on which their compensation is paid?
Yes.
Yes. No, this was in 1973 when they were literally very young, and it's not changed. And, one of the challenges when we accept someone new is also slotting them in to the scale, and also focusing on their original damage, not their consequential damage, which can be difficult. And I think another thing that is a real issue for us is as people get towards 60, they develop health issues, and a lot of people think, well, that must be because of my thalidomide, but actually, you know, who knows, they could have developed a lot of health issues, arthritis or what have you anyway, and so I think that the question of is this thalidomide related or not becomes a little bit, you could get really sidetracked into that. So I think this issue of saying if you have needs that cannot be met from the funding you're receiving now, then we will look at if there's ways of providing additional funding, but not getting into arguments about, well, is that, you know, hearing loss is a good example where some people say, you know, with hearing loss that must be down to my thalidomide, but actually when you get in your 50s a lot of people do experience hearing loss anyway, and it's quite hard to be able to say is, you know, yes or no on that.
Can I also ask you, thank you for that, but can I also ask you about your relationship with Diageo? I mean, we did have a problem when actually I was a minister with Diageo running out of the funding, and then there was great concern that this would all come to an end. Now, they are still continuing to support you and to give the annual grants and all the rest of it. Do you see any change in that relationship, or is it still as strong as it was initially when they were involved?
I mean, I think the relationship with Diageo now is stronger than the relationship in the early days with Distiller Company. So the Distiller Company was taken over by Guinness, and then Guinness and Granmet merged and formed Diageo. And Diageo are very responsive. We have a legal covenant which sets out that they will pay our beneficiaries an annual grant for as long as they live. So that's a legal agreement, and we have taken legal advice to say that if, for example, someone was to take over Diageo, those liabilities would be part of the package. So I think we're very confident that we have as much. I mean, I think because of the size and strength of Diageo, it's unlikely the company would go bust and disappear. But as long as the company is operating, then they have an obligation legally to provide that funding. But over and above that, we have ongoing dialogue with Diageo. We have annual meetings where we share evidence of need and information about claims. And every 6 years, we have basically a renegotiation based on the data we have from actuaries around life expectancy of beneficiaries. I think that unfortunately the two variables in terms of how much money Diageo will have to pay us over the lifetime of the trust are the life expectancy of beneficiaries, which is really hard to predict because they're a unique group, and secondly is investment performance, because obviously the funds we have from Diageo that haven't been distributed are invested, and at the moment both of those are very, very difficult to predict. So we do scenario planning with them, but certainly they have to make provision, and it's in their annual accounts, and they have made a commitment to fund the charity. So we feel quite secure from that point of view. Less so on the health grant, which is only agreed until 2022 at the moment.
So when Guinness were involved, how was the negotiation carried out in order to ensure that they had some responsibility for this? I mean, we're looking at other issues,
Yes.
obviously, and very interested that here we have a commercial company who feel a sense of responsibility.
Yes. Well, Distiller accepted responsibility originally, and when they were taken over by Guinness, that responsibility moved with the company.
So the negotiation was with distillers.
Yes, the original compensation deal was with distillers in 1973, and that has then been followed through. I've got to be honest and say I don't know how long the covenant's been in place that actually moves it onto an absolutely firm legal basis, that funding. But certainly that obligation moved from distillers to Guinness, and then from Guinness to Diageo.
Can I just ask about the status of the charity? Am I right in thinking that you changed from a charity to a charitable company?
Yes.
Can you just explain for us why you did that? What benefit it derived?
Yeah, there was long debates about whether we should do it or not, and we only made the change last year. And the key reasons for doing it were really around the liability of individual trustees. So in our old status as a discretionary trust, the trust didn't exist in law. So if anyone was to sue the charity or there was any sort of breach, it would be individual trustees who would be liable. Now, obviously, there was indemnity insurance to support them, but it was something that I think was of concern to some trustees. Coupled with that came the increased sort of scrutiny of charitable trustees by the media and elsewhere, and in terms of ensuring that we continued to attract good quality trustees into the future, we felt it was important we modernised. But the other thing was very practical, because the agreements weren't between a charity and a company or individual. Often we had to get signatures from all our trustees when we entered into big agreements, and that was a logistical nightmare, because you've got trustees all over the country trying to send contracts and agreements with them. So now, as having a single corporate trustee, then a trustee can sign on behalf of
So you're
that.
a company limited by guarantees at home?
This isn't my strong point, or the legalities, but we are a charitable, yes, a company. I think it must be a company limited by guarantee.
That's certainly the phrase that's used with a lot of other charities that have just done what you have done.
Yes.
And there was quite a movement among the charitable sector
Yes.
to become companies limited by guarantee.
Yeah, I mean, we were quite a late comer to it, and I think the feeling was just if the charity had been set up today, it wouldn't have been set up in the way it was, and it was just an opportunity to review the arrangements. And I mean, one of the interesting things is all the trustees are now directors of the new company, but we've been very clear that we continue to refer to them as trustees, because for our beneficiaries it's important they see it that way, and we do operate as a charity. We're bound by the guidance from the Charity Commission, and we don't want to give the impression we're a commercial company that have got some, underlying commercial reason for existing. It clearly was around the governance and the structure and sort of how we operate as a charity.
But they actually function like non-executive directors.
Yes. Yeah.
Good.
Very interesting. Any other questions?
So can I just ask, when you were previously then a discretionary trust, you still had managed to negotiate this tax-neutral position, because I understood that discretionary trusts attracted quite high levels of taxation. So
Yes.
that was something that had been negotiated, and in fact, through a discretionary trust, you were still able to negotiate that?
Still able, yes. So this is going back a number of years that the beneficiaries had to pay tax on the money they received from the trust. And there was a campaign, and to be fair, that was led by our beneficiaries. It wasn't the trust staff. We have some very effective campaigners amongst our beneficiary community, and they felt it was really unjust that the money they received was then taxed. So they led a campaign, and that was agreed. But being a discretionary trust didn't stop that happening.
How much time as the vice chairman of the trust, how much time do you spend on the trust?
Well, I'm a paid member of staff, so
You are?
yeah, yes.
Oh right, But presumably not all your trustees are paid members of staff. They're
None of our
voluntary.
trustees are paid, and some of them give a lot of time to the trust.
Yes.
And that's why, going back to my answer to the previous question, we felt it was really important that we were able to continue to attract trustees who were
Yes.
able to bring their expertise and time to the trust, and we didn't want to have any barriers to that. So yes, it really does vary by trustee, but they do put quite a significant amount of time into
But
the
actually your administration costs are very low compared to some other trusts.
Yes, that's right.
Right. Sorry, any other questions?
No, very helpful, thank you.
Thank you so much.
That's all right.
been